right. Okay. Good morning. My name is Thoko Kaime. For those that do not know me, I'm the Professor and Chair for African Legal Studies at Bayreuth. This workshop on climate justice in the Global South is a commencement workshop for our students taking a module on this topic. And we have arranged a series of seminars within this workshop where we introduce some key concepts in the climate change debate, particularly those concepts that border on climate justice. Now, we have had a presentation by Stephen Turner, but also Philippe Coulet, dealing with the institutional arrangements, and then followed by a discussion on the normative frameworks related to climate change. And I think this is a good point to look at how states in the Global South navigate some of these structures that we've set up at the international level. So I'm going to do that by looking at the example of the African Union, because institutionally the Union has been mandated to take responsibility for negotiating climate change options for African states. And I think it gives us a very good perspective into how the issue of justice is applied within the international system. Okay, all right. I'm going to share some slides. Well, I call them slides, but really they are place markers so that you can determine where we are in our chat. I really would like to investigate a couple of issues in relation to the African Union. Firstly, by looking at the whole situation of climate change and why it's a problem for African states and also the Union itself. And then look at Africa's participation within the regime. And I'm going to assess the performance of the Union by looking at one of the most recent conference of the parties. You know, how did the African group of negotiators perform using the tools that have been given to them by international law. And then I'll end by asking whether the normative and institutional framework as it is now can actually achieve justice despite the fact that justice seems to be front and center of the regime. Okay, all right, let me share the screen. I think that's the right one. Okay. Okay, are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay. All right. Okay. So before we opened the class to everyone, I had a quick chat with some of my students, and we're talking about how justice has shaped the climate change regime. And I think this is important to highlight, because it is clear that justice lies at the center of the climate change regime. We noted earlier that a scientific theory about climate change has always existed since the 19th century. But scientific consensus about this particular matter did not coalesce until perhaps the mid-1980s. As more data became available, and computing power allowed more accurate modeling of the implications of climate change, we see now states moving towards a realization that something had to be done about climate change, and then it becomes a political problem. And once it becomes a political issue, national positions demonstrate a notable distinction between rich and industrialized countries on the one hand, and poor and developing countries on the other. And this reflects the principle of differentiation that Philippe was talking about earlier. And this principle had been, evolving since the 70s within successive international environmental treaties. And so, for example, these early calls for international climate justice, North-South equity becomes central. And the core really is this, that developed countries should show exemplary leadership because the climate problem has been generated by the manner of industrialization that they have gone through. Now, Stephen introduced the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the key institution established by the United Nations Environmental Programme and the World Meteorological Organization to create a global focus point for climate science and formally linking science with intergovernmental politics. And this reflected, again, a need to connect the science with the politics. And this report makes this link again between the arrangements that are being put in place and justice. And so we see in that report where the IPCC identifies the specific responsibilities of industrialized countries, and noting that domestic measures were required because a major part of emissions affecting the atmosphere originated in industrialized countries where the scope for change was greater. So we see, even with this first report, this differentiation in relation to responsibility. And so the case for different accountability and obligations set out in the IPCC's first report was quite crucial in setting the stage for justice to remain central to the international regime, because it provided the basis for legitimacy and for expressing justice arguments in the language and data of science. So all these principles that Philippe was going through on equity and common but differentiated responsibilities, etc., have got a foundation not just in the law, but also in the science and the politics of climate change. Now, as would be expected, developing countries seized on the points made by the IPCC to press their case for capability, because there was historical responsibility against the rich countries in how climate change had come about. And in the negotiations for the development of the international regime between 1990 and 1992, we see this taking place within the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, which had been established by the UN General Assembly. And the controversy about how you share out these responsibilities emerged right from the outset. And these controversies continue up to this day, where rich countries also appealed to justice, but in a bid to counter perspectives that would obligate them to greater leadership and responsibility. So they make the justice argument, but to escape culpability for what had happened in the international system. There's a lot of research that's already been done that shows the various ways in which contestations for justice have shaped the design and evolution of the climate regime. So firstly, for example, it is noted that early agitations for procedural justice by developing countries resulted in the climate regime being brought within the remit of the UN General Assembly, right? So it was not just some subcommittee of the United Nations Environmental Program. Developing countries felt that one country, one vote system adopted in the UN would help mitigate their inability to participate on an equal footing with developed countries in the relatively narrow realm of or technical realm of the IPCC. I mean, this was a body filled up with scientists and all of that, and developing countries didn't feel that they were being represented. Secondly, the concern for justice was central in the shaping of the UN framework on climate change, with developing countries keen to highlight the close links between climate change, food security, and sustainable economic development. And we see this in the provisions of the convention itself, as Stephen highlighted. Now, and then third, concerns for justice resulted in several equity principles and provisions being included in the UNFCCC and its Kyoto Protocol. And key equity terms included common concern for mankind, for example, common but differentiated responsibility, per capita emissions, and historical responsibility, amongst others. Whilst notable equity-based provisions include differentiation between countries with respect to emissions reduction obligations, commitment to North-South financial and technology transfers, and acknowledgement of the special need for vulnerable countries. Okay, so it is clear when one looks at the regime that justice is at the center of it, but does it deliver justice? And I think this is a question that is particularly important for developing countries, because they suffer the impacts, but haven't contributed to this problem, perhaps in the same way as developed countries have. Okay, now, something that we haven't looked at this morning is, an outlook for climate change itself. I mean, how, what are the prospects? What does the science say now? And it is very clear, or the science is resoundingly clear, that average global temperatures have increased by more than 1 degree Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. I mean, that is clear the data already shows that. In 2019, greenhouse gas emissions continued to rise in spite of evidence stressing the urgency to cut them. So despite science being clear that we need to cut down, the trend is upwards. In fact, greenhouse gas emissions have increased at the rate of 1.5% per year throughout the last decade, only briefly stabilizing between 2014 and 2016. So we are not reducing despite all these measures that we've had under the UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol and its replacement, the Paris Agreement. In November 2018, the world's leading climate scientists at the IPCC published a report comparing the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels with the impact of a 2-degree warming. And these findings corroborate the fact that significant irreversible climate impacts will already occur at 1.5 degree rise, hitting the hardest, the poorest and most vulnerable populations, those that do not contribute to the problem. And that these risks are substantially lower than those expected for a 2-degree rise scenario. So it is in the interests of the global community to make sure that action is done, even though the trend is upwards, but to make sure that this does not continue. The same report also found that the current emission rate, at the current emission rates, warming will already reach 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052. So this will result in major changes in regional climate, and particularly in places like Africa, causing extreme temperatures in most inhabited regions, and then the scientists indicate that they have a high confidence in these data models. So this is something that will happen if the current trends are maintained. Okay, all right. Now, what are the impacts for Africa? Because of its geographic location, high reliance on rain-fed agriculture, and limited adaptive capacity, no place on Earth will be as disproportionately affected by climate change as the African continent. No place on Earth. Among the world's 10 most vulnerable countries, 7 are located in Africa, and these include Sierra Leone, South Sudan, Nigeria, Chad, Ethiopia, the Central African Republic, and Eritrea. This exposure and vulnerability poses serious concerns to the continent's food, water, security, human health, and overall prospects for economic, social, and environmental development. Then, with predictions with future precipitation patterns varying widely, predictions for future temperatures are more consistent, and it is clear that temperature rises in sub-Saharan Africa are projected to be higher than the global average temperature increase. Okay, so at the modeling done for a 2-degree temperature rise, temperatures are expected to rise twice as fast in Southern Africa in comparison to the rest of the world. And under a high emission pathway, the IPCC foresees global warming of 4 degrees by 2100. And with that scenario in mind, warming in parts of Western and Southern Africa could reach as much as 6 degrees. And for those that come from Southern Africa, it is clear that the climate has changed. More droughts, more floods, hotter summers, and all of that is already happening even before we hit a 1.5 degree rise. Most of the African continent is already prone to extreme variations in rainfall, and predicted changes to rainfall patterns indicate that Northern and Southern Africa will become drier and Eastern and Western Africa will become wetter, with adverse effects on agriculture and significant implications for food security. The losses from agriculture will be immense right across sub-Saharan Africa. And in addition to this, a number of reports have indicated these connections between climate change and conflict. It is clear that existing state fragility multiplies the risks associated with climate change. If a state cannot provide adaptive capacity or mitigation capacity, it means that the conflicts within groups, within those particular states will actually get worse. And we already see examples of this, especially in places where they are experiencing multiple cycles of droughts and floods and that. So we see in the Sahel region, for example, where the conditions are already fragile, and you add on top of that desertification and land degradation and drought and loss of biodiversity are already deepening economic marginalization, increasing tensions, and providing fertile ground for terrorist group recruitment. And so it is clear that for many African countries, climate change is actually a threat multiplier. It makes difficult situations even more challenging. Okay, so given this context, what has been Africa's role in the climate change regime? A number of provisions mandate the African Union to address climate change at the international level, and African states have become gradually more organized in international fora in relation to climate change. African institutional cooperation on climate change can be traced as far back as 1985, with the first meeting of the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, or AMCEN, which took place in Cairo. The 13th African Union Assembly established the creation of a Committee of African Heads of States on Climate Change in 2009, and it tasked this committee with putting forward a concerted African position on climate issues in order to ensure that the continent would speak with common voice during global climate change negotiations. And amongst other things, it was tasked with charting strategies for Africa's participation and raising Africa's profile in climate negotiations. In 2014, the Common African Position on the post-2015 development agenda was a key opportunity for Africa to articulate its priorities, amongst which figured the environmental sustainability, natural resource management, and disaster risk management. And at the 2015 African Union Summit, the AMCEN, the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, was asked to develop, together with the African group of negotiators, a proposal to support Africa on adaptation. Right? I'll be mentioning the African group of negotiators quite a bit in the subsequent slides. The same year, the African Union also brought forward plans for negotiating a common position with the Bureau of African Group of Technical Negotiators in Nairobi. So since about 2014, 2015, we see African leaders and the African Union making a lot of progress in developing a common position, urging developed countries to provide sufficient and predictable financing, along with the transfer of technologies and capacity building. These are provisions in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The principles on which the whole climate regime is built on. But it is clear that they still have to be fought for as a political measure. In the margins of the Conference of the Parties in Marrakech, this is COP22, an African Summit for Action was held, marking the launch of the AAA initiative and announcing the Congo Basin Blue Fund. COP22 also signaled strong political leadership by African heads of state and led to the creation of 3 climate commissions: the Congo Basin Commission, the Commission for the Sahel region, and the Africa Island States Climate Commission. In accordance with UN tradition, parties to the UNFCCC are organized into regional groups, namely African states, Asian states, Eastern European states, Latin American and Caribbean states, and Western European. Developing countries have worked normally through this group of 77 and China in order to establish common negotiating positions. An African group of climate change negotiators, the AGN, as I described above, is the structure that represents African countries' interests during international climate change negotiations. It is responsible for drafting texts and common positions and adopting positions during the Conference of the Parties. The African group of negotiators has played a key role in building a consistent and cohesive stance on issues of particular significance to the African continent. So, for example, it has been a strong advocate for the right of developing countries to develop and for equal treatment between adaptation and mitigation efforts in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Despite prior divisions on whether developing countries should play any role at all in mitigation. Okay, so Africa's positions in climate negotiations have historically been fixated on adaptation and much less on mitigation. And given, I mean, this is because of the continent's low contributions to global greenhouse gas emissions and its exclusion from any quantified mitigation commitments under Kyoto. So under Kyoto, there were no mitigation measures taken on by any African country. So there was no real need to participate. So one of the AGN's key highlights for Paris was the inclusion of a global goal for adaptation. And this is in Article 7 of the Paris Agreement. And this global goal for adaptation will be assessed through a global stocktake every 5 years, starting in 2023. It has been argued that the consensus reached in Paris on mitigation has enabled African leaders to begin turning their attention to an issue where agreement has been easier, securing funds for adaptation. As such, much of the AGN's recent efforts are focused on attracting increased financing to build Africa's adaptive capacity. But despite this success, it is also quite clear that negotiators for the African continent have been confronted with the difficulty of unifying the competing interests of a large number of countries with varying socioeconomic realities and priorities. I will not go into the different states and their priorities and what they see as priorities. I mean, you see that the development paths that are being taken by a lot of these countries are quite different. So we've seen over the last 10 years South Africa investing heavily in core energy systems. At the same time, there's been development of renewable energy by many other states in Southern Africa and West Africa and that. How do you bring all these interests together and have a common position amongst all 55 African countries? This is not easy. And in a lot of cases, the African countries are negotiating alongside other developing nations such as China and India. How do you come to a common position given the development trajectory for China, but also for India? So it has been quite difficult to achieve suitable African positions in relation to the climate change regime. Another important point is that in comparison to major negotiating blocs such as the EU and others, the African group of negotiators lacks sufficient financial and technical resources to compete on the same level with the other negotiating blocs. And this is a real handicap, especially within the pressure of Conference of the Parties, where positions and their implications have to be assessed quite quickly, but also with accuracy and that, and this has been a handicap. Okay, so I think it's important now to see how this responsibility or has been met by the African Union, considering how they performed at the last conference of the parties, and this was COP25. This was held in Madrid under the Chilean presidency in 2019. It's the longest COP on record. It was extended by almost 2 days. That's not a good thing that it was extended by 2 days. It's because states just would not agree, there's problems, major problems on agreeing targets and these nationally determined contributions, or NDCs as Stephen called them. The negotiations involved a high level of detailed technical discussions on a variety of issues, and African delegates continued to push for changes to climate finance beyond the voluntary donor pledges, because they were insisting on the spirit of the law within the UNFCCC and also the Paris Agreement. And one of the priorities for the AGN was to raise the level of ambition for nationally determined contributions as the implementation phase approached. In particular, African countries that were also members of the Alliance of Small Island States and the least developed countries wanted harsher and faster mitigation commitments. But we saw that industrialized developed countries did not want to take on these obligations. And now the global goal on adaptation, I've already said that this was a win on the part of the AGN, but it was also controversial, and the discussions continued around a joint framework on agriculture, which aimed to ensure that agricultural development safeguards both food security in the face of climate change and does not prevent emissions reductions. The AGN, alongside with other developing countries, called for more money to support adaptation measures in this regard, particularly for farmers. It is hoped that at the next COP, which is supposed to take place in December, but has been postponed by a year because of Corona, farming and farmers, agriculture is supposed to take a more central role, and it is likely that the AGN will take a leading role there. Okay, all right. There were also issues on climate finance at COP25, where there was not so much success by the AGN. They called for the definition of a new post-2020 target and stressed the importance of grant-based resources to avoid increasing debt burden of developing countries. But the commitments made, particularly by OECD countries, was less than they had hoped. Another key issue at COP25 related to loss and damage. And here again, COP25 was considered a lost opportunity on making progress on how developing countries have suffered from climate change related events up to now, and for those that are responsible for it to make good those losses, so to compensate for climate change related damage. One of the main sticking points in this discussion was setting up a finance arm under the international mechanisms under the UN Framework Convention. Very long negotiations, okay, to cut that short. Long negotiations resulted in general acknowledgement of the need to help poor countries cope with climate disasters, but nothing emerged beyond that. The US in particular insisted on language protecting it from liability claims in the future, and therefore blocking progress in the loss and damage talks. The AGN tried to coalesce with developing countries, other developing countries, including China and Brazil, but no agreement was forthcoming. Okay. Another part where perhaps this was, I mean, COP25 was not quite so successful, is the agreement for implementation guidelines of the 2015 Paris Agreement, which were all agreed except for Article 6. Article 6 would enable countries with low emissions to sell their surplus allowance to larger emitters with an overall cap of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is to create a market for those countries that are not damaging the environment to get money from those that whose emissions are quite high. There was no agreement on this, and it is hoped that perhaps at COP26 there will be the political consensus to achieve something. And perhaps it's a blessing in disguise that COP26 has been delayed. The AGN might come up with a more nuanced negotiating strategy that allows success, as we saw that this was difficult in the previous AGN. So it is great that Africa's got these possibilities to negotiate within the climate change regime, but international politics is a big concern, but also technical capacity is another limiting concern. Okay, I would like to finalize my comments by asking the question whether the international regime can accommodate changing national circumstances, increasing scientific urgency and multiple perspectives on justice. I mean, is the regime as it is structured now capable of doing that? It is clear that justice remains crucial to a new multilateral climate treaty. There were some positive signs in the past about climate justice, and I think Paris was a good indicator of that, but there are grounds to suggest that the trends towards voluntary commitments, particularly under the nationally determined contributions, are leading to some parallelism, where rich and poor countries seem to share similar commitments. I mean, this goes against the basis of the climate regime from the start, where you have common but differentiated responsibilities. There's a danger that rich countries don't take on their own responsibilities as they are required to. There's a strong interconnection between economic circumstances, geopolitical power, and justice claims that nations can assert in negotiations. Events within the climate regime highlight the importance of questioning the extent to which claims of justice can ever be truly realized in the context of international regimes of environmental governance, as well as how much concerns for justice are motivated by other concerns such as relative economic gains or geopolitical objectives. It's a dangerous mix for climate change, as we can see. It would appear that the progress made in entrenching justice at the heart of the climate regime is being seriously threatened by global financial crisis. We're seeing now countries whose economies have tanked because of coronavirus will they be forthcoming in paying for their liability? I strongly doubt. So I think the next year is going to be quite interesting in terms of the African Union's performance within the regime. Okay, I'll stop here. I've run out of time, and maybe take a question so we can then invite our next participant, our next lecturer. Okay. Okay. Okay, Otieno and Yango, I've seen your questions. Oh, there's quite a few here. Okay, all right. There's quite a few. Okay, let me propose this. I should come back to these questions maybe after Professor Malcolm's presentation, and I'll respond to all of these questions. I think they raise quite important matters that I should not rush through, okay? But Rosalind has taken her time to be with us, and I would like to yield the floor to her now, okay? Now, there was a question about what human rights or human rights bodies can do to address climate change in Africa. And then there's a follow-up question from Nicholas and also JB about the international human rights framework itself and whether it provides, you know, a suitable framework of accountability, and more specifically, whether there is any jurisprudence that has been given by these courts in these frameworks to address climate change. So I'll try and address this as a compound question. So within the African human rights system, it is clear that there are principles both on the procedural level, but also the substantive rights that protect human rights that have got a relationship to the environment. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but many of these rights, such as the right to life, right to reasonable standard of living, a right to development, and a right to a healthy environment, are all environmental rights at a substantive level. And these have been explained by some of the institutions within the African systems, including the African Commission on Human Rights and the African Court in several cases. So it's clear that there is a basis there for claiming environmental rights. Is this framework sufficient? I think on its own, no human rights framework is sufficient to tackle climate change, but it's a very essential tool for tackling climate change, alongside other measures that we have within the international system, whether at the regional level within the African system or beyond that at the UN level. So we have to utilize the tools that we have within the human rights system, alongside the other efforts that we're doing, for example, under the UNFCCC processes as well. How do we do this? It's by articulating the responsibilities of states, the rights of individuals, the responsibilities of business in relation to environmental protection, but also the protection of our climate by pointing to these rights that are in the various documents that we see, whether it's at the African system or the UN level. Are there cases? Yes, there's quite a lot of cases, and the examples from the African Commission, but also the court, dealing with the issue of the environment. Now, JB, as you know, the way of developing case law is quite iterative. Some of these principles may not say you have a right to be provided with mitigation measures or adaptation measures in accordance with the UNFCCC. But the court will look at the jurisprudence that has been issued before and argue, for example, that in order to maintain your right to a healthy environment, it is important that states have in place plans for mitigation or plans for adaptation. This is iterative. It's what lawyers do. You develop from past principles and you add on to that. How about the regional courts? Should they have this? I mean, this is an interesting question because we see in relation to the regional courts, which have emerged out of trading arrangements, we see these courts more and more taking on human rights jurisdiction. Okay, so they have a very expansive interpretation of what their jurisdiction is, and so we've seen a number of human rights cases being developed in these courts, and it is likely that some of the cases that have got environmental implications will also end up being taken up by the ECOWAS or COMESA courts or the East African Court of Justice. Okay, Otieno, you ask about what we should do in making climate change a key political debate in African states. I think the easiest thing to do is to show how relevant it is in people's lives. You know, we can't talk as lawyers. We can't, you know, go to communities and say, okay, the Paris Agreement, Article 7 says this and that. We have to explain these principles in a way that matters for these people's lives, you know, impacts on livelihood, impacts on health, for example, impacts on education and all these things that make up what a good life should be. I think that's how then it becomes a political issue. And that's why the climate change debate cannot just be a discussion amongst lawyers, even though lawyers are quite important. It must be a conversation that you know, connects with all constituencies that are impacted by this. And this means everyone. We have to find ways of communicating the law, normative principles in a way that attaches to general discourse in the community. Okay. And Diango, finally, you asked whether the African Union is advancing in the fight against climate change. And my view is that given the tools that the institutions of the African Union have, yes, I think they are doing their very best, but I would love to see more resourcing by African states on these particular measures, because we've been hamstrung by you know, the technical and institutional resources that we have. We cannot rely on the people from whom we would like the climate damage that's been done to enable us, you know. It's like, you know, in a football game, to use the poor example, you know, expecting the opponent to substitute two of their players and not give us and not replace, you know, just to give us an advantage. It's not going to happen. So we need to make these resources as Africans. We need to make these resources available so that we can compete more fully at these negotiations. We need more technical experts. We need you know, more lawyers, you know, more scientists, and all of that. And this has to be provided by Africans themselves. We can no longer rely on the various blocks that we are trying to impose these climate liabilities to make that available for us. And so, yeah, the short answer is we are doing the best with what we've got, but it's still not good enough, and we have to recognize this, and we need to make a political decision to ensure that this changes in the future. Okay. All right. I think this is a good point on which to have a break. I think we'll take a 45-minute break in this class. And I look forward to welcoming you back to the talk by Professor Kaime Mbote and Professor Nick Oguge. And so I shall see you in about 45 minutes. Okay, thank you.